Looks like it's working. Great. Did you guys want to get started or wait for anyone else to pop in? Oh, I have one more person. Hi.
Hello.
Great to have you guys. So I guess we can get started. It's 3:02. Oh, there's him. So someone else can't make it. So yeah, let's get started. The first chapter was like the big question we had was, why is the labor of the bee different from that of like a person, a human labor? We went, Cockshot and the other writers went through like the different ways that bees and humans architects plan, and how that planning reduces the local entropy of their environment, even though it doesn't. Although of course it's not exempt from the second law of thermodynamics. So I guess we should start with what are you guys' thoughts on that first chapter?
So I thought it was a bit unfair to knock Marx's architect and bee thing, because I think in the context of that chapter in Capital, it's kind of a throwaway observation, isn't it? It doesn't. I thought that I didn't think Marx was really setting himself up for that degree of unpacking of the metaphor. I don't know. That's what I felt.
I think that's fair. I think that it was kind of necessary, though, for where they're trying to get in terms of bringing together information theory and the labor theory of value.
Right.
Makes human labor special, and it's not really fully explained yet because we're kind of building up this argument. But what makes it special, and there are hints of it here, is that humans have the ability to not just plan things, but to change the plan, to choose to do different things and figure out different ways of how to do them on the fly, and not just as like individuals, but socially, and that allows us to have a universal application, basically, in terms of human labor. Human labor, given enough time, could basically do almost any physically possible task that we can think of, and that has allowed like all of like the society to come where it is technologically, economically, and so on.
Yeah, because the real difference between the labor of the bee and the labor of the architect, the real difference between animal labor and human labor isn't that the animal can, isn't that the bee can't choose what it's going to build, but the human can. The difference is, and I'm guessing this is why the choice of readings from Capital and Grundrisse. The point being that the bee is only making its hexagons. It isn't making a hexagon making machine, right? If the bee was making a hexagon making machine, then then bee labor and human labor would be more comparable, wouldn't they?
Right. Yeah. That's kind of why the text on the fragment on machines, I think, is rather important. It goes through well, it goes through how we coordinate things today, like what determines how we plan, how we execute and plan production on like a grander level is determined by capital, basically. And he goes through how that kind of that contradiction there with like between circulating capital and fixed capital, of like circulating capital hides how we're relating to each other as like laborers. Like it hides how workers in one industry are facilitating labor in another industry. It makes it look as though that is the result of capital. Whereas fixed capital is kind of a distillation of scientific knowledge and as well as just regular human labor that it determines that plans and chooses what are like techniques and the way that we work via how it was planned, how like the machine demands them based on scientific and technical qualifications, which is like this thing that's supposed to facilitate us moving beyond capitalism. So like in the going back to the metaphor, I guess, of the bee laborer versus the human laborer and the bee planner versus the human planner. Humans like even when we look at tool usage in animals, it's not the same in terms of the way that machines are in our present society, because animals, for those animals that use tools, they're doing it as like an extension of themselves, right? As they're doing this, like the knowledge of how to use that tool, maybe they've even come up with it abstractly, we don't know. But human societies have like the capability of inscribing our knowledge into machines to act back upon people. Whereas the ants or the bees, they're not like they're still only inscribing, it's not inscribed back on them, basically, is what I'm trying to get at. Like there's nothing in the beehive that like there is sensuous information, but there's nothing about the structure of the beehive that isn't the result of the individual bee's instructions. Whereas the machinery in human society, while it on an abstract level, it may have been planned out to have a certain impact on people, to get it to work in a certain way, it inscribes social knowledge itself back to us. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Although what that has to do with Maxwell's demon is not, I mean, like something really struck me about chapter 1 here is like the readings from Marx. Obviously, just it's marvelous to look at this stuff again, even if you've only looked at it like a few months ago. It's still marvelous to have an excuse to look at it again. That's all lovely. Chapter 1 of this book really, I mean, it's like a bluffer's guide to thermodynamics, isn't it? It's not saying anything new yet.
Right.
And then chapter 2, it's the next stage of the story, and there's the information theory element. Again, it's a story that you encounter in, like there's a lot of books with this as chapter 1 and 2, right? And then it ends in this massive cliffhanger. It's like we're only going to get to the meat in the next session, aren't we? Because so far we've got Maxwell's demon and then information entropy, and then there's going to be the big reveal in chapter 3 as to. But at this stage, like we could talk about the fragment on machines all night, and I'd love to because it's wonderful. And we could talk about Maxwell's demon for a while but the link between the two isn't there yet, is it? We've got to wait for that, I think. Though maybe there are people on this call who've had the audacity to read ahead. I don't know. Who's read ahead? Who's read chapter 3?
Not me.
Not
I
me.
held off as well, but it's the temptation's pretty strong, right? Because that's where the meat is, I think, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. That's where it really gets interesting, because now we have to combine these disparate threads that have kind of been hinted at so far. I think that it's kind of necessary to do the build-up that we have here. So I mean, for a general audience, might not even have been taught entropy in the proper way, or even at all. And you really have to explain these steps before going into the meat of the argument, basically.
And I think the really important thing in this stuff is what we've read so far is the bit in chapter 2 which explains, and this is something that like a lot of popular stuff on this really misses, like that terrible this terrible book. Who's read this terrible book?
I have not.
No, really, I haven't. I think I've heard of Paul Mason, but I don't.
So he's a UK leftist journalist. Used to be a TV economics journalist, but left TV to become like more overtly Marxist, and wrote this really bad book. And the really bad book, the thing that it does badly that so far classical econophysics is doing well is that Paul Mason didn't understand the difference between information in physics and kind of data, useful information that we humans recognize as useful, and that's so crucial. I think everything else in chapter 1 and chapter 2 is building up, I think, to that key point that when we talk about information in the context of physics, we're not talking about something good or desirable. We're talking about like a mess.
Yeah, it's trying to. You have to cut off the anthropomorphized or whatever word they use at the end of the chapter, sense of information of just data that's useful to us, because in physics, everything has information. Things that have no bearing to us. It's how like these objects out there are relating to each other rather than to us as subjects.
Because I think that the thing it's trying to avoid us taking in the direction of is this idea that it may be maybe labor is imparting information to things, because of course imparting information to things in this physical sense would be like taking a hammer to them, right?
Right. Well, in a sense, it's already described that work and labor in any kind of useful sense for the bee or for the human is entropy minimizing. It's trying to lower the entropy in its environment to get it into useful forms for itself. And just to give you a hint of what's to come, there'll be a whole using this framework to look at not just human labor, and also looking at how this relates to fixed capital and machinery, but also what role markets play in terms of entropy, which will be very important for modeling markets and equilibrium. I do think that, did anybody get a chance to read that section from More Heat Than Light? Yeah, I thought that that might have been really helpful towards understanding the historical role that this book is playing, which I did not really fully grasp until I read that section, which is, and actually, well, there's another section that's I have included in a supplemental reading later on that also helps with this. But economics as a system, a field of study, hasn't really been able to incorporate classical thermodynamic models into itself. It's kind of stopped at that proto-energetics level, or whatever word that was used, of physics before thermodynamics and entropy got on the stage. And as a result, it kind of has this utopian quality to it that every transaction, the whole model that they use is static. It has no sense of the arrow of time in the way that entropy demands. and what we'll see is like the important results of that, of introducing that into models throughout this book.
Cool.
Like, so do you guys have any background in economics and in the kind of modeling that they do?
I have a little bit of economics from college, but my degree was actually in chemistry. So I did some work with thermodynamics and quantum, and I'm kind of, what really interested me about this class is that there's apparently like a lot more of a back and forth between physics and economics than I first thought. I really thought that these were disciplines that kind of went off. I actually didn't even think that they ever really crossed paths. But apparently there's lots of dialogue and breaks in dialogue apparently that that I just wasn't aware of. So there's a lot going on for me in this course.
Oh yeah, it's if you really want to get into the historical like detail in there of the back and forth and the breakdown, definitely read more of Philip Murowski's book, because what economics has often done is try to sweep that debt to physics under the rug, more or less, in order to establish itself as an independent science. And if you really like the modeling that economics has done, and this, I guess I never really include in any of the readings, but it's very important for understanding like the relationship between Marx and classical econophysics and modern neoclassical economics, is that modern neoclassical economics doesn't have a theory of value anymore, of a general theory of value. It has a theory of prices, and it has from Marshall, it explains why a specific commodity is sold for this specific price, but it can't integrate that into a theory of why a chair is worth twice two pairs of twice a certain amount of coats or whatever. It can't explain exchange ratios or relationships between industries in a very theoretically rigorous way. Because what it tried to do with general equilibrium theory was expand like that Marshallian framework so that it could come up with an equilibrium for the whole economy in that kind of static way. Or even when it tried to do dynamic equilibrium, it totally broke down. They couldn't do it. And so eventually, after trying to do it on computers up until like the 70s or 80s, they just gave up. And in that sense, classical econophysics is the only real theory that does that anymore, that actually models it.
I think I follow you. Can you speak at all as to where the if you know a thing about neoclassical economics, the infamous DSGE, dynamics stochastic equilibrium, general equilibrium? Is that kind of, was that the effort made?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe so. I think that's what you're talking about.
Okay, and that fell short.
Yes, everyone's basically given up on that.
Interesting.
I mean, does anyone have any questions about entropy, since it's been such a big part of the two chapters that we've had? Nope. Okay. Let's see. I have some other notes. I guess we could talk a little bit more about. Let's see, Max. That's one thing I find interesting about entropy that I haven't really thought about when they were describing the logic circuits in Maxwell's Demon, like the hypothetical logic circuits in Maxwell's Demon. That any information process that has less outputs than inputs is going to produce that that it's going to decrease information. It's going to destroy information and create energy in a different way than what it's like processing. And I like, if you think about that for a minute, it makes sense. But I had never figured that until I read that.
Yeah, it's very sort of out there to think about like information and energy as this,
and the practical
comparable.
application of that with the computer chips, which totally escaped me the first time I read this, that in I guess it'll be 20 years now, and we already, I guess, starting to see the impacts of this, of the heat like limit of computation. Like eventually computer chips will give off so much heat that that'll be the limit of computation of like computer chips, basically, of their efficiency. Which is a crazy thing to think about, that'll be at the current rate of change in just a decade or two. And the fact that that's not a result of like electricity or anything like that, of it's the actual heat of the computation itself. That's kind of crazy to think about.
I agree.
I guess the other big thing, if we want to go back to it, is how, like the discussion in Marx's Fragment on Machines, of how, because this is probably one of the bigger themes of the book, I think, and it relates a lot to labor productivity and how machines, how humans are integrated into machines for the purpose of production. And if you read Cockshot's other book, Towards New Socialism, that really goes into cybernetics and the possibilities of like socialist planning through these methods, I think is kind of the logical conclusion of this, of how like we can get fixed capital machinery to get us beyond capitalism, basically. Who is able to get a little bit into the Fragment on Machines?
I've read that before in various accelerationist contexts.
Yeah,
Comes up
well,
a lot.
It is. I've skimmed it a couple of times before now, and this was really the first time that I really dug into it in depth. And there's such a richness there. And the more that I read Capital, and the more that I read stuff like this from the Gundry, the more that I realize there's such an important place in Capital of fixed capital, and its teleological role in history of not just like it's like what we discussed earlier, of its scientific potential of planning production, and how like the greater it expands, the greater productive capability of society, as well as the greater it diminishes our like the necessity of human labor, and also demands less human labor in production because of the way that value coordinates that production. And we'll be getting into in the next couple chapters, we're going to be talking a lot more about value. I think, actually, let me look at the supplemental reading list. Yes, we'll be talking a lot more about, next chapter is a lot about the division of labor, as well as labor productivity. And I also assigned that it's an excerpt from this book on the history of pre-computational like machine, like calculation devices. So it's this reading about the history of the slide rule, which I thought was pretty fascinating. And it's gestures at its role in industrialization. But I'll open up the floor to like any discussion you guys want to do, and if you guys want to call it early or whenever, let me know. I mean, I put an hour on the clock, but it's pretty much arbitrary.
So I thought, I mean, a thing that sprung out at me from the Grundrisse section, the fragment machine stuff, was this point that, because I mean, I'm much more familiar with the bits of Capital Volume 1 that derive from this than I am with this itself. And it struck me that there's this, here, he gets into this deep debate with this guy Lauderdale. Now, I haven't read the Lauderdale stuff, but the question's a really important one about the kind of it being axiomatic that capital, fixed capital, circulating capital, these forms of capital don't, constant capital, in effect, constant capital doesn't create any new value. It's only variable capital that can do that. We know that, and that's like axiomatic. And in Capital Volume 1, he just chucks it out there. He just says, obviously, constant capital doesn't create any new value. It can only impart to the commodity the value that it itself possesses. And then, bang, once it's worn out, all of that value is then imparted to the subsequent commodities. Fine, okay, thanks, Carl. I just found it really interesting that in the fragment, it's something that he really feels he needs to debate. You know, it's like it's something he really feels he needs to get kind of engaged with this Lauderdale guy over this question, and that just falls away subsequently. I just found that interesting. I'm not sure I've got anything useful to say about it, but it just was quite striking.
No, I think that's important. Like if we go to the Capital Volume 3, he kind of expands on it a little bit, of talking about how the tendencies and counter tendencies of the rate of profit to increase or decrease. And what he mentions is that whatever productivity increases you get from technology, competition will, like whatever that gets you in terms of value and like in money capital coming in, that's lost through competition when everyone adopts it. And this is actually going to become more important later on, because there's a discussion of what is it called? It's, I think, Okishiko's theorem, or Okishio's theorem. That's right. And basically, it shows through like the standard Sraffian analysis of like inputs and outputs, that if you're assuming, well, one, I think that is a flaw in there of like, if you're assuming the same prices, and of course, this will result in there being actually some surplus created by the new fixed capital, by the innovation. But we can do like more analysis on like prices, for example, of different industries, and see how productivity gains has changed the relative prices between industries. And you can see this in like the inflation statistics going back decades, that it's those industries that are able to innovate and increase labor productivity that have price decreases, and it's those that don't, that have inflation going up.
This is a slightly different point, though, isn't it? I mean, the point that I'm referring to is leaving aside any innovations, any developments in technology. Just thinking of kind of just thinking of one circuit of inputs and outputs. and I kind of think it's easier to think if you imagine rather than a manufacturing scenario or an assembling scenario, if you imagine a transportation scenario, just because it's kind of easy. I mean, if you've got a you've got a sailing vessel sailing transporting some commodities across the ocean, and obviously the labor of the sailors is the only kind of variable capital. We know that, let's say the commodity, we know the commodity attracts a higher value at the other side of the ocean, because that's why it's being sailed to that market over there.
Mm-hmm.
And the only variable, because it's the same commodity, right, on our side of the ocean, it is the other side of the ocean. The only variable capital that's being added is the labor of the sailors.
Right.
And someone might come along and say, well, no, then all of that value, that comes from the boat, because the sailors aren't pushing the boat. It's the wind that's pushing the boat. So the sailors are just facilitating the fixed capital of the boat, attracting, capturing value from nature. That's what someone might argue. Someone who wanted to kind of argue with the labor theory of value, they might say it's all nonsense to say that the additional value in the commodity at the other side of the ocean comes from the labor of the sailors. The additional value, this devil's advocate, as it were, comes from the fact that you can catch all of that power of the wind in the sail of your sailing ship. And the counter argument to that is presented as in Capital Volume 1 is presented just as an axiom that the sailing boat can only confer upon the commodities that it's carrying the value that it already has once it's worn out, once the sailing vessel's rotted and all of its value has become entropy, right? then that's gone into the commodities, and do you see what I mean? It's just chucked out there, but it's kind of clearly when he was writing Fragment on Machines, he felt that that called for a counter argument, but he doesn't. But he loses that. He just feels that it's fine, and everyone's going to get that. Which may be right. I mean, if it may be that he had reason to be confident in his audience, in his readership in that way at that stage. But obviously now he doesn't. I think it's probably if you were going to be writing this now, you'd probably need to engage in that. You probably need to engage that argument, I would have thought.
Well, I think he makes an implicit argument a bit in Capital Volume 1 when he's talking about exploitation, because he reasons that the way he explains that labor creates surplus value is because only labor can be because of the difference between what capitalists get when they buy labor and what they're actually paying for, because they're paying for the cost of reproduction of the workers, but what he's actually getting is their labor power, which he can intensify or make them work longer without actually having to pay them anymore, depending on whatever situation. If you were to increase the working day, you would increase exploitation, they would make more profits, and so on. With fixed capital, what are you paying for? And this is as an accountant, I'm very what I see Marx's arguments, I see mirrored the way that businesses understand their capital expenditures, which is they understand it through the lens of depreciation, right? So what you're paying for when you buy a machine is you're buying the ability to use this machine for however long you expect its life to be, whether that's measured in units of production or years, and that's actually reflected in the price, basically. And I think that's like, there's nothing different about what you get than what you're paying for with the machines. If that make like the well, actually, let me back that up, because that actually implies another aspect of this, right? Which is the price of the machine itself and the cost of the machine, making the machine. And that cost is spread out over the certain amount of time, right? So if you work the machine harder, you're just wearing it out faster. You're not getting anything more out of the machine. And if it's the same thing if you work it longer per day. I think that's Marx's argument on why machines don't necessarily create value.
Yeah, although I mean, the argument I think we're probably, I guess the argument we're going to get out of Cockshott and his friends, which, and I'd be very sympathetic to it. I think if this is where they're going, then I'm sympathetic to it. It's presumably the counter argument, going back to the illustration of the ship going across the ocean. The point is that if you just set the sails and let kind of random forces take the commodities anywhere, they wouldn't get to market. The only reason why, like that huge force of the wind may be the motive force that carries the commodities across the ocean, but unless there's a hand on the tiller, they won't get to market.
Right.
So it's.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think I'm sure you're about to latch on to the core point of what I was saying faster than I was. So go ahead.
No, I think that's a very important point of their argument, and especially like with the argument that we get in chapter 2, that human labor, or that any living labor, is basically Maxwell's demon in action. Of course, not being able to break the laws of thermodynamics, but able to use information to coordinate, to reduce entropy locally.
Wait, but you don't mean information, do you? Or do you? Because the whole point of chapter 2 is to persuade us that information isn't good. So, for example, let's say I'm heading out from Liverpool and I want to get my goods to New York. And I've got my hand on the tiller, and the more arbitrary my tiller motions, the more information they have, right?
Right. I don't mean that they're trying to increase information. I mean that they are information processing, like Maxwell Demon is. That they have their logic circuits or whatever. They have like intelligence, right? Yeah. That allows them to change, like to manipulate their environment to create useful work. And usefulness demands like lower entropy for us.
Yeah.
And I think that the way that this argument is going, in the conclusion that we're going to get in the next few chapters, is that artificial intelligence, if we were to create like our own Maxwell's demon computer or whatever, then we would see the law of value break down, because human labor would no longer be totally generalizable, or would not be the only thing that is totally generalizable. There would be something else that could do the same information processing that we do.
Yeah.
But that would still depend on, I guess, if you were to envision that future economy, it would still depend on the relative costs of AI as a manager and regulator of labor, of work rather, versus human labor.
If anyone's interested, I listened to Ian Wright, one of the authors, to talk about this exact question of like whether machines create value. And yeah, it's on the link I just shared.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, I think he asked me to include this in the list of supplemental reading.
All right. and maybe it's already there.
So I guess we'll get further into this discussion as we go further into the book, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't need persuading that machines don't create value. I'm sure they don't. I'm just very interested in the shape of the terrain of counter arguments, that's all. So I shall read that with enthusiasm.
He also has an audio version as well. As well as the other thing that he has that I've included from Ian, which he is a great, very innovative thinker, I think. He is like, which you'll see once you get to the stuff on super integrated labor values, which once I understood it, and it took me a long time to understand it, but once you understand it, you'll think, why didn't anybody think of this before? And then you'll realize it's the same reason that you couldn't understand it for so long. But yes. Do we have any other parting ideas, I guess? Because that's all I have in my notes at the moment. Really, there's only a couple big ideas per chapter. He takes the time like a good computer scientist to give us the proof, basically. But there's only a couple really big ideas. What's the difference between human labor and bee labor? What's entropy? And yeah, those are the two big ideas. So if you guys want to, if you have any parting remarks, otherwise, I guess we can wrap up and come back in 2 weeks for the next 2 chapters.
Can't wait. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
No
thanks.
problem.
This is good.
I think I'll
Thank you.
upload this recording to YouTube if that's okay.
No, please don't.
Oh,
Please
okay.
No.
How should I distribute it? Should I just send it via email to whoever wants it?
Yeah, if individual, I don't want it in public, honestly.
Okay, that's no problem.
But I would have, if I thought it might end up on YouTube, I'd have been like that.
No worries. Yeah, I'll just email it to whoever asks for it, and we'll do it that way.
Or maybe it could just be audio.
Sure. I could probably do it that way.
Because it's like Faces is great for making a conversation in real time, but I don't think it's necessary for people catching up afterwards.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take the audio and I'll upload that to YouTube. And I'll probably be unlisted anyway, because I don't know. It's not like anyone's going to be really interested in this.
My sense is our names are not going to be tagged. Not going to be tagged to the YouTube audio file.
Cool, brilliant, thank you.
No problem. Well, it was great to have you guys all here and being able to discuss this with some people, which I have not been able to do really in a long while. So thank you.
Great.
All right, you guys have a good 2 weeks.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.
Bye. Cheers.